The honourable member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Acting Speaker. In May 2022, communities across Australia, including my own in North Sydney, sent a clear message to this place of national government. Climate inaction and prevarication needs to end, and we, sent here by our communities, must do everything we can to ensure faster, tangible action to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. This is not to say we should act irresponsibly, but rather we must embrace all of the skills and thinking present in this place and across our wider community to develop smart ways we can not only take stock of where we are, but can then also enact a transition plan which will ultimately transform not only our economy, but more broadly our place in the world. As I stand today, Speaker, to speak on the Safeguard Mechanism Crediting Amendment Bill 2022 then, the weight of my community's faith that I will speak their truth in this place is something that I am honoured to carry. I need to be clear. In its current form, the Safeguard Mechanism Bill does not meet my community's expectations. It is not bold enough. It is not ambitious enough. And ultimately, it is much less than this government could do, given that more than any other government in the past 100 years, this government has been given a clear mandate to move our country forward in a nature-positive fashion. While this legislation is not perfect, it does provide us with the scaffolding for a more effective framework to drive productive change at an industrial level. The question then that I believe we must answer as we debate this legislation is, are we brave enough to make decisions today, the ramifications of which will be long felt into the future in a positive fashion? This legislative amendment should not be looked at as simply a short-term solution to deliver on a political promise made at the last election. Rather, it should be seen for what it really is, which is one of the most important first steps in fundamentally transitioning and transforming our future economy so both our nation and our planet can thrive. In this context, I am committed to working with the government to ensure petty party politics does not ultimately impede what can be a very important and significant step for our nation. Just this past week, the latest Australian Productivity Commission report specifically called out the hodgepodge of narrow and sometimes inconsistent federal, state and territory abatement measures that impose unnecessarily high cost on the community while delivering ineffective abatement. From my perspective, I think the Productivity Commission report adequately described the limitation of a framework that is arguably the result of a series of decisions made within the context of successive election cycles rather than from true leadership mindset. Describing the decarbonisation of the economy in the next 3 decades as a huge transformation, the Commission warned that the difference between doing it efficiently and doing it poorly will be a major determinant of the living standards of all Australians. Indeed, the report said the economic cost of this approach are increasingly apparent, laying bare the reality that decisions—
that the bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for North Sydney in continuation.
Thank you, Acting Speaker. Indeed, the report said the economic cost of this approach are increasingly apparent, laying bare the reality that decisions to avoid technology-neutral economy-wide abatement mechanisms do not avoid the pricing of emissions, but rather only lead to a myriad of very high implicit or shadow emissions and shadow prices. The Productivity Commission rightly identifies this legislation to be the principal economy-wide mechanism for achieving national abatement targets. But for this to be the case, we must empower it so it can achieve its full potential. Communities and households across the country, including my community in North Sydney, are already doing the heavy lifting on reducing emissions, installing household solar, choosing green electricity providers, reducing energy consumption and increasing energy efficiencies, making the switch from gas to renewables and shifting from petrol to electric cars or to active and public transport. But the reality is our emissions reduction challenge cannot be met by individuals alone, and Australia's largest industrial facilities have a crucial role to play in reducing emissions in line with our national ambition. Any shortfall created by large industry not pulling their weight will have to be picked up by others. As it currently stands, the safeguard mechanism only covers 215 facilities, each of which emits around 100,000 tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions every year. This adds up to 140 million tonnes, which is the equivalent to 28% of Australia's total emissions. Gas extraction and coal mines make up 56% of the emissions covered by the safeguard mechanism, and 4 of the top 5 emitters are gas export plants operated by Woodside, Chevron and INPEX. Strengthening the safeguard mechanism will ultimately future-proof our economy, as it will strengthen the investment drivers that guide decarbonisation of industrial processes. And this will strengthen Australians' competitiveness in a carbon-constrained global economy. Our largest exporters know global markets are moving to a low-carbon future, with more than 80% of Australia's trade now covered by other countries' net zero commitments. Staying competitive and on track for net zero by 2050 will be critical to avoid penalties from carbon border tariffs imposed by other nations and trading partners in the future. Acting Speaker, with all of this said then, I am advocating for 3 key changes to this piece of legislation. They are 1. Restrict the use of offsets and ensure their quality. 2. Prevent new or expanding fossil fuel projects from accessing government funding to purchase abatement. And 3. Bring more polluters into the mechanism over time. Emails from and conversations with people across my community leave me in no doubt that the people of North Sydney believe this legislation must be more explicit in conveying a clear hierarchy for true and gross emission reduction or on-site abatement prior to allowing facilities and industries to simply purchase Australian Carbon Credit Units, or ACCUs, as a way of netting out their emissions. The absence of any limit on the purchase of ACCUs creates a significant risk that the reformed safeguard mechanism will allow continued emissions our environment cannot afford. To put it simply, as it currently stands, the legislations will allow large companies to pay to pollute. By focusing the legislation on achieving true gross emission reduction, we can ensure genuine reductions at the point of production. It is through the lens of true gross emissions reduction that the strength of the safeguard mechanism reforms should be assessed. The Chubb review into the Australian Carbon Credit Unit found it is important to have a policy, but it is critical that it be effective. To be effective, abatement must be real, and it has to be known to be real. Following on from this, then, I am moving a second reading amendment calling on the government to commit immediately to implementing and fully funding all 16 of the Chubb review recommendations, which include a range of proposals to improve the operation of the scheme. I move the amendment circulated in my name. This work must be done in time for the safeguard mechanism to commence. While some have criticised the Chubb review for not going far enough, I would argue the recommendations provide us with an important starting point, a floor, if you like, for ensuring the quality of Australia's carbon offsets regime. However, whilst uncertainty over the integrity of ACCUs remains, we should look to minimise their use and ensure the hierarchy is clear, with facilities prioritising on-site abatement before externalising their emission reduction obligations. The priority should be on-site abatement, the direct and real reduction of emissions through technological and efficiency improvements. Once the opportunities for on-site abatement are saturated, then facilities can turn to the Safeguard Mechanism credits, or SMCs, which are intended to be high-integrity, multi-year, science-aligned credits in a closed system. Only after these first 2 options are exhausted should ACCUs then be able to be used. I would also argue that there should ultimately be a cap of, say, 5% on the number of ACCUs that can be used to ensure compliance with the safeguard mechanism. However, I recognise this may be something that needs to be phased in over time. The Australian government has also already announced it will support the decarbonisation of existing industries and creation of new clean energy industries through $1.9 billion Powering the Regions Fund. While there are many examples of industries that will undoubtedly need this support and are much wanted in our economy, including things like green cement and green steel, there are also emission-intensive, trade-exposed facilities that will arguably be less desirable in a future economy, including many fossil fuel extraction facilities. The Safeguard Transformation Stream within the Powering the Regions Fund should explicitly state that it is not available to new fossil fuel projects or expansion of existing licences, with this legislation instead doing everything it can to ensure these projects all find their way to net zero as soon as possible. Whilst there's been a lot of discussion around overall emissions reduction targets, the pathway to achieving our net zero goal remains unarticulated. To address this, and in line with previous recommendations by the Climate Change Authority, I propose the government legislates to progressively lower the coverage threshold for the safeguard mechanism from 100,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions down to 25,000 tonnes. This ratcheting down over time would send a very strong investment signal and set a clear trajectory to net zero for industry. Working alongside the reduction in the threshold, the bill should also incentivise broader sections of industry to reduce their direct emissions by allowing them to opt into the scheme and thus opt into generating safeguard mechanism credits. This opt-in stream would have the dual benefit of increasing the number of polluters who will reduce their pollution, whilst also increasing the supply of SMCs, so those in the harder-to-abate sectors will have access to a larger number of high-quality SMCs from within the safeguard mechanism. Then, to enhance anti-avoidance measures outlined by the Minister, the bill should be amended to stipulate facilities which are covered by the mechanism at the commencement of the Act will remain covered, even if they reduce their emissions below 100,000 tonnes. Together, these measures will ensure genuine emissions abatement and reduction by the broadest section of large emitters. Acting Chair, each generation in human history must be held to account for the actions that they take and the legacy they leave. Arguably, for those of us born between 1965 and 1980 and known as Generation X, this decade, in this century, is that moment of reckoning for us. Those of us that are Gen Xers have ultimately witnessed some of the world's greatest advances, including space exploration and the development of the personal computer, and many of this generation have already shaped the world during pivotal years of great change and technological advancement. As a member of that generation, then, I say to all others who join me as Gen Xers, at this time, in this place, we must stand now to ensure the legacy we leave is one we can be proud of. The time for talk is at an end. Let's be the change we wish to see in the world.